Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. It is difficult to speak of the first victim of the Black Death. The plague itself had already traveled far before chroniclers gave it a name. It appeared suddenly in villages, entered through ports, and seemed to spread faster than words themselves. Archaeologists, centuries later, have tried to locate the earliest grave, the very first place where the earth swallowed a body that carried this new and terrible disease. One such suspected burial lies near Lashevo, a quiet town along the Volga River in present-day Russia. To modern eyes, it is an unremarkable patch of land. There is no dramatic churchyard, no elaborate tomb, no memorial stone. It's just soil, grass, and the faint marks of disturbances left centuries ago. Yet it is here that researchers have traced one of the earliest burials possibly linked to the 14th century. Pandemic, the Black Death, as you know, was not simply a sudden disaster. It was the eruption of a bacterium, Yersinia pestis, that had long existed in the burrows of wild rodents across Central Asia for generations. It lurked quietly, contained within the cycles of fleas and marmots, hidden from human notice. The first victim in Europe, or even in Asia, is therefore a matter of interpretation. Was it the first merchant who caught the disease in a caravan camp? Was it the first fisherman in a Caspian village? Or was it the anonymous figure laid down in this Russian soil, carried there in the early 1340s as the pandemic swept westward? Archaeological evidence is often quiet and unspectacular. In Lashevo, scientists unearthed bones that bore no visible trauma, no sign of violent death. The individual had been buried with ordinary care hands, folded, body stretched, the sort of position that suggested a normal ritual. But under the enamel of the teeth and deep within the pulp of the bones, DNA revealed something extraordinary. The traces of Yersinia pestis were preserved, like faint echoes of a whisper left inside the marrow. For centuries, no one could have known. To the mourners, this burial was just another in the long succession of deaths that punctuated medieval life. People died, often of fevers, infections, childbirth, hunger. The grave was filled, the soil pressed back, and the memory of the person vanished into routine. Yet, centuries later, laboratories brought out the secret. This could have been among the very first in Europe when we speak of burial customs. It is worth pausing to remember that medieval graves were not uniform across cultures. In Russia, Christian burials had a simple orientation eastward, toward the rising sun. Coffins were uncommon in rural areas, and more often, a wooden plank might be placed beneath the body, with earth carefully filled over it. Personal belongings were rare in Christian graves, but sometimes a cross or a simple piece of clothing remained. In Lashevo, the grave seemed ordinary in all these respects. What set it apart was not what was seen, but what was hidden microscopic traces of the bacterium that would devastate continents. The soil itself preserves silence. Imagine the mourners, family members, perhaps neighbors. They lowered the body, perhaps with quiet prayers. No one suspected that what lay in that grave was not simply another life lost, but the harbinger of millions more. Did they notice any difference in this death? Was the illness sudden, violent, accompanied by swelling and fever? Or was it simply another fever that burned too quickly? Historians cautioned us to call this the first victim is misleading. The Black Death likely killed thousands before this burial. The disease had spread from the Mongol steppe along trade routes down into the Caspian and through caravan towns. Each stop created victims. Each victim had a grave, most of them now lost or unmarked. But this grave, uncovered and tested in modern times, is among the earliest we can scientifically prove. The study of plague burials is not glamorous. Archaeologists must dig through layers of soil, cataloging bones, scraping for DNA, the fragments of information, how deep the grave was, what orientation it followed, what pollen grains surrounded to create a slow, patient picture. These are boring details, perhaps, but they matter. They reveal whether a death was part of an epidemic, whether graves multiplied rapidly, whether burials became hurried. In the case of Leshevo, dead, surrounding graves seemed normal. There was no evidence of a mass pit, no hurried trench filled with dozens of bodies. This suggests that the plague, at that moment, had not yet overwhelmed the community. It was still a singular tragedy, not yet the tidal wave it would become. The first burial, then, was quiet, ordinary, almost invisible in history. And yet, this ordinariness is what makes it haunting. The Black Death did not begin with a roar, but with a whisper. It did not arrive in Europe with trumpets or banners, but with one quiet burial, one unnoticed death, indistinguishable from thousands of others. Only centuries later would we return, spade in hand, to realize what lay beneath. But how do we define a first victim? Can we ever truly locate the beginning of a pandemic that moved invisibly through fleas and rodents, striking in silence long before it was named? Or are we forever searching for a grave that will always remain just out of reach? Asterisk, when the soil at Leshevo gave up its quiet secret, that faint trace of Yersinia pesticide raised more questions than answers. How had the disease reached this corner of the Volga? Why here and why then? To understand, you must follow the slow, plodding paths of trade, the silent networks of exchange that connected distant worlds. Long before the plague became infamous, the Black Death did not appear. Suddenly, in 1347, as chronicles often suggest, it had a prelude, a hidden stage in which merchants, herdsmen, and soldiers carried it westward. Kiev was not an isolated hamlet. It was a town in the Volga Basin, a region that had long served as a corridor between Central Asia and the markets of Eastern Europe. The Volga was a river highway, a route for goods, furs, and grain. Wherever goods moved, so too did stowaways, rats, fleas, and unseen within them, the bacterium. The story of plague is, in many ways, the story of movement. In Central Asia, marmots and gerbils served as the original hosts, carrying fleas that could leap to humans under the right conditions. Traders hunting for pelts disturbed burrows, carrying infected fleas into camps. Fleas rode on clothing in bundles of grain inside furs. The bite of a single flea could introduce the bacterium to a human host. Fever rose, swelling appeared in the lymph nodes, and within days, death often followed. But epidemics do not begin with a single case alone. They require networks, roads, ships, markets. In the early 14th century, the Mongol Empire still connected vast territories. Caravans stretched across the steppe, guarded by soldiers, bearing goods between east and west. Along with silks and spices came invisible cargo. The empire's very strength, its unity of trade routes, became a highway for disease. By the time plague reached the Volga, it had likely traveled through multiple hosts, multiple towns. Each link in the chain was invisible. No chronicler wrote of it. No villager carved it into memory. Instead, death appeared in ordinary houses with ordinary symptoms. Fevers mistaken for other fevers, swellings mistaken for bad boils. Only when numbers mounted would people understand that something different had arrived. Archaeology confirms this slow beginning. In plague cemeteries dated to later years, you find evidence of panic, bodies piled hastily, graves dug in trenches, multiple individuals buried together. But in Lashevo and in other early sites, burials remained deliberate, singular. The first victims were treated as ordinary dead, not as signs of an unfolding catastrophe. Think for a moment about the role of faith here. In medieval Christian burial practices, the body was oriented toward the east, awaiting resurrection at the Last Judgment. Priests might bless the grave, though in rural areas, the ritual could be simple. Family members would bring the body, sometimes wrapped in cloth, sometimes with a wooden support beneath. The grave would be dug by neighbors, not professionals. Life was fragile, and death was familiar. The plague's first victims, then, were folded into this routine. There was no reason, yet, to mark them as exceptional. But, from this ordinariness, a great question emerges. How many such burials lie undiscovered, scattered across Asia and Eastern Europe, holding the bacterium's earliest whispers? The first confirmed grave is only the one that has been studied. Countless others, never excavated, may hold the same secret. Each would look unremarkable, just soil, just bones. Only modern science can distinguish them. The Lashevo grave serves as a reminder that the plague's origins were not sudden explosions, but gradual seepages. Imagine the Volga River in the early 14th century. Traders guided boats loaded with furs, wax, and grain. Markets bustled with exchange. X clung silently to sacks of pelts. A bite in one village, an illness in one household. The sickness spread slowly, invisibly. The community did not yet know that this was something vast. When we studied this first victim, we must also study the wider web. How far had the plague already spread by then? Some records suggest outbreaks in the steppe even before 1340, linked to Mongol military campaigns. There are references to mysterious fevers in towns near the Caspian. Chroniclers in Central Asia mention mortality among soldiers and herders. But these references are vague, folded into the general language of pestilence that could mean many things. Without modern testing, certainty is impossible. What is certain is that by the mid-1340s, the Black Death would appear in force, recognized as a distinct catastrophe. But in these early years, in these early graves, it was quiet, but present. The work of archaeologists in this field is almost paradoxical. They search for meaning in what looks meaningless. A row of skeletons, a tooth extracted, DNA fragments amplified in sterile labs. The answers are never dramatic. They come in percentages, in gene sequences, in faint matches to the bacterium's signature. And yet from these numbers, we reconstruct the story of how one of humanity's greatest disasters began. The mute soil of Section 1 has now become a whispering soil. The bones speak faintly, but they point outward, to caravans, to rivers, to empire. They remind us that behind every pandemic lies a network, and behind every network lies human desire for trade, for profit, for connection. It is those desires, ordinary and constant, that carried the plague westward. So when we imagine the first burial at Lashevo, we must also imagine the unseen world around it, the merchant boats sliding on the Volga, the caravan animals stamping along the steppe, the unnoticed flea in a fold of fur. Together, they formed the path of contagion. But if this grave was among the first in Europe, who was the person laid there? What life had they lived, and what hints can archaeology recover of their ordinary existence before the plague made them extraordinary in death? Archaeology often confronts us with fragments, bones without names, lives without records. The grave at Lashevo is no different. We do not know the individual's name, their precise age, or their role in the small riverside community. And yet, the fragments whisper possibilities. Through the silent remains, we can attempt to piece together something of the life that was lived before the plague transformed it to a marker of history. The bones suggest an adult. The teeth, worn but not destroyed, indicate someone past youth, but not elderly. The skeleton bore no obvious signs of violence, no fractures from sword or accident. Instead, there were faint indicators of the ordinary burdens of medieval life, joints showing early signs of wear. Small stress markers on the limbs where muscles once pulled, a body shaped by labor. These were not the scars of battle, but of daily survival. Life in 14th century Volga towns was defined by modest routines. People here lived in wooden houses with packed earth floors, heated by simple stoves. Food was plain bread, made from rye, stews from cabbage or millet, fish pulled from the river. Livestock grazed nearby, their presence woven into the rhythms of household life. The community was Christian, but its customs carried echoes of older traditions. Bells might ring from a local church, but charms and folk remedies still found a place in daily practice. To imagine this person's final days is to imagine ordinary illness turning into something new. Perhaps it began with a fever, the kind that villagers had seen many times. Perhaps swollen nodes appeared on the neck, beneath the arms. Perhaps neighbors whispered that this was unusual. But still, the rituals of care would have been familiar. Water, cloths, whispered prayers. When death came, it was mourned as death always was, with sorrow, but also with acceptance. Death was no stranger in medieval life. The burial itself followed the expected pattern. The body was laid flat, oriented eastward. There was no evidence of wealth, no jewelry, no possessions placed in the grave. A simple death, a simple burial. Nothing to suggest to those present that this was the start of a disaster, and yet it was. Modern DNA analysis confirmed Yersinia pestis. In that tooth, sealed beneath the enamel, the bacterium left its trace. This meant that the person had not simply died of fever, they had died of plague. They were, by accident of preservation, one of the earliest confirmed plague victims in Europe. This shifts how we think of history. For centuries, chronicles told us the Black Death arrived dramatically in 1347, carried by ships into Mediterranean ports. But this burial suggests an earlier, quieter entry, traveling overland, creeping into small communities before the world took notice. The plague story, then, is not only of sudden waves and mass death, but of slow, hidden beginnings. Think of the irony. The very ordinariness of this burial preserved its significance. If the body had been cast into a mass pit, DNA might have been harder to isolate. If the grave had been disturbed, the evidence might have vanished. But here, in one careful, ordinary grave, the traces remained for centuries. This is the paradox of first victims. They do not know they are first. They are not remembered as first. Only centuries later, with microscopes and sequencers, do we give them this role. The community that buried the person in Leshevo did not know they were burying the beginning of Europe's catastrophe. They were simply burying a loved one. And this forces us to reflect. How many beginnings of great disasters go unrecognized in their moment? How many first victims lie in graves, unremarked, unnoticed, until history later reclaims them? The Black Death would go on to reshape Europe. It would decimate populations, shift economies, weaken feudal bonds, and alter faith. But all of that began with quiet burials, like this one. Ordinary people whose lives were short, whose deaths were unremarkable, but whose bones now remind us of the fragility of human existence. The grave at Leshevo is not dramatic. It is not a monument or a battlefield. It is simply a hole in the ground, filled and forgotten. Yet it anchors the story of one of history's greatest calamities. And so we end this first story, where we began with the soil that keeps its secrets. until one day, centuries later, we dig and listen. But if this grave is one of the first, then what of the later burials, when the plague was no longer a whisper, but a roar? What did the great mass pits of Europe tell us about fear, desperation, and the overwhelming tide of death? Asterisk, by the time the plague reached London in 1348, there was no more mistaking it for an ordinary fever. The signs were unmistakable now: swelling buboes, sudden collapse, the terrifying speed of death. Chroniclers recorded panic, sermons thundered warnings, and ordinary Londoners watched neighbors vanish in days. This was no longer a hidden whisper in the soil, as it had been in places like Le Cheveau. This was a roar in the heart of a crowded city. London in the mid-14th century was already dense, noisy, and filthy. Its population was approaching 80,000 large by medieval standards, streets narrow and unpaved. Its water supplies, often mixed with waste. Livestock wandered openly, refuse collected in ditches, and the Thames served as both river highway and open sewer. Disease of all kinds was a constant threat, but the plague was something new, something the city was not prepared to absorb very quickly. Parish graveyards filled. Every churchyard in London had its plot for burials, but the scale of death overwhelmed them. Priests could not keep up with services, gravediggers could not dig fast enough, and mourners could not process the unending tide. Something different was required, so the city turned to East Smithfield, located just outside the city walls, near the Tower of London. The land of East Smithfield was set aside by royal order as an emergency burial ground. This was not a churchyard, but a great open field, hastily consecrated and given over to the task of swallowing thousands. Excavations, centuries later, would reveal its grim scale. Long trenches dug into the ground, bodies laid shoulder to shoulder, row upon row. Some pits held dozens, others hundreds. In total, the site may have received as many as 2,500 victims during the peak waves. The burials were systematic, but hurried. Archaeological studies showed that bodies were carefully arranged, not thrown in chaos. They were laid in rows, sometimes, with thin layers of soil separating one group from another. Priests were present, performing what rites they could. Even in the panic, there was an attempt to preserve dignity. The dead were not animals discarded, but souls entrusted to the earth. Still, the scale was unmistakable. This was no ordinary cemetery. This was a response to catastrophe. The objects found at East Smithfield tell us more. Unlike earlier Christian graves, where individuals might be buried with small personal items or in distinct coffins, here the burials were stripped of individuality. There was no time, no space. Skeletons were aligned, their positions repeating like echoes. In some cases, entire families seemed to have been buried together, their deaths close enough in time to allow for shared burial. In others, the victims were strangers, united only by the disease that carried them to the same trench. When archaeologists studied the remains, they found confirmation of the plague's violence. Traces of Yersinia pestis were detected in teeth, confirming that the cause was indeed the Black Death. Skeletal analysis also revealed signs of malnutrition and pre-existing disease. Many victims were already vulnerable, poor, weakened, living hard lives before a plague struck. The Black Death did not strike evenly. It exploited weakness, spreading faster among the poor, the crowded, the already frail. Imagine the sound of the city at that time, the tolling of church bells, constant and weary, the shouts of carts carrying bodies through narrow lanes, the cries of those who feared they would be next. Imagine East Smithfield itself a growing field of earth, opened again and again as more pits were dug. The smell must have been overwhelming, yet, in the face of this, life in London carried on. In fragments, markets opened, food was sold, ships arrived, People continued because they had no choice. The plague was not simply a biological event, it was also a test of institutions. The crown, the church, the city governmental had to respond. East Smithfield was a product of that response, organized, sanctioned, and managed at a time when many cities lacked such capacity. Doubted, the crisis might have been even worse. Instead, London created one of the most famous plague cemeteries in Europe, a site that still whispers the story of 1348 to 1349 beneath its soil. And yet, what strikes us today is not only the scale of the pits, but the quiet order in them. In the midst of panic, there was structure. In the midst of overwhelming loss, there was ritual. The city, even as it crumbled under fear, still sought to impose meaning on death. But what does East Smithfield tell us about the lives of those buried? They are not only how they died, but how they lived. What stories are written in their bones, waiting to be read? Asterisk, the East Smithfield Cemetery is not only a site of death, it is a record of life. When archaeologists unearthed the long trenches, they did not only count skeletons, they studied them. Each bone carried traces of how its owner had lived, worked, and suffered before the plague finally took them. In this way, East Smithfield became a library of ordinary London lives, preserved in silence for centuries. The first thing to note is age. The victims were not all the elderly, as one might expect from modern epidemics. Many were young adults, even children. Some skeletons bore the signs of incomplete growth, showing they had not reached full maturity before the disease struck. Others were infants, buried with mothers in the same trench. The plague struck across the age spectrum, sparing neither the young nor the strong. Then there are the signs of work. Bones develop stress markers, tiny changes in shape and density that reveal repeated movement. In East Smithfield, many of the male skeletons carried the signs of heavy labor. Arm bones thickened by years of lifting, spines compressed by strain, knees marked by constant bending. These were the bodies of workers, porters, craftsmen, builders, dockhands. London was a city that consumed labor, and its poor gave their bodies to its streets, docks, and markets. Women's skeletons tell different stories. Many showed signs of chronic malnutrition, their bones thinner and more fragile. Childbearing left its own marks, widened pelvises, in some cases fractured or worn from repeated pregnancies. Some bore healed injuries, signs of survival through difficult lives. Even in the silence of their final rest, their bones speak of poverty, resilience, and the toll of survival in a crowded medieval city. And then there are the diseases that existed long before the plague. Skeletons reveal lesions from tuberculosis, a disease that gnawed at lungs for years. Others show the curved spines of rickets, caused by vitamin D deficiency in children who grew up in crowded, sunless alleys. Teeth revealed enamel defects, permanent scars left by childhood malnutrition or fevers. These were not healthy populations, struck suddenly by plague. They were already living on the margins, weakened by hunger and disease. The plague did not simply arrive, exploited existing vulnerabilities. The layout of East Smithfield burials adds another layer of meaning. In some pits, archaeologists found bodies arranged in neat rows with care to keep them aligned. In others, signs of haste appear, bodies overlapping layers of earth too thin, children placed at odd angles. These variations suggest the ebb and flow of the epidemic. At moments when deaths were slower, burials had dignity and order. But at the peak, even with organization, the sheer volume overwhelmed care. Priests hurried through rites, gravediggers strained under demand. Dignity gave way to necessity. One discovery that stands out is the presence of small tokens among some skeletons, though most were buried without possessions. A few bore traces of rosary beads, buckles, or fragments of clothing. These were not luxurious items, but they showed the persistence of faith and ritual. Even when the world was collapsing, families still sought to send their loved ones into the grave with a sign of devotion. The plague did not only kill, it reshaped society. The scale of loss was staggering. Scant suggests that London may have lost nearly half its population in those years. Every trade, every guild, every family was touched. The East Smithfield pits are only one cemetery, yet they contain thousands. Imagine the dozens of other churchyards, the countless graves in villages beyond the city. Each one was a loss that rippled outward, breaking households, ending lineages, silencing lives. Yet, in studying these remains, archaeologists have uncovered unexpected details about resilience. DNA testing of the bones at East Smithfield has revealed not only plague bacteria, but also genetic clues to human survival. Some descendants of survivors carried mutations that may have helped their ancestors resist the plague. These genetic legacies are still present in living populations today, faint echoes of the selective force of the 14th century. In this way, the cemetery is not only about death, but about survival, adaptation, and the deep marks of history written into the human genome. Consider how different this is from the quiet grave at Leshevo. There, the first victims seemed ordinary, indistinguishable, their death unnoticed by history. At East Smithfield, by contrast, death was public, overwhelming, impossible to ignore. The contrast between one quiet burial and thousands in a single trench shows how quickly the plague transformed from a whisper in the soil to a thunderous collapse of cities. But there remains a question. What happened to those who tended to these pits? The grave diggers, the priests, the laborers who carried bodies day after day. How did they survive, if at all? Were they buried in the same trenches they helped fill? Or did some endure, scarred by memory, carrying stories of East Smithfield into the years that followed? Asterisk. The East Smithfield Cemetery is one of the most studied plague burial sites in the world, yet at the time of its creation, it was meant only as a practical solution. A field turned into trenches, a response to panic, a way of managing what felt unmanageable. But centuries later, this ground has become a lens through which we understand not only the catastrophe of the Black Death, but the endurance of human communities under strain. The pits themselves disappeared from memory after the plague subsided. London rebuilt, life resumed, and East Smithfield returned to ordinary use. No great monument marked it. There were no long inscriptions or stones to remind future generations of the thousands buried there. The ground was simply folded back into the living city, as if the silence of the dead was itself a kind of covering. For centuries, the people who had once filled the trenches were forgotten. It was only in the modern era, when development unearthed human remains, that their presence returned to public awareness. Archaeologists, anthropologists, and geneticists descended on the site, carefully cataloging skeletons, mapping trenches, and sampling teeth. What had once been an emergency measure became, over time, one of the most important archaeological archives of the plague. The very efficiency with which East Smithfield had been organized rows, layers, separations made it possible to study it with precision centuries later. The findings have been profound. Scientists confirmed through DNA that Yersinia pestis was the cause of death, silencing debates about whether the medieval plague described by chroniclers was the same disease known today. They also learned that the bacterium strain preserved in East Smithfield was ancestral to many later outbreaks, tying the London epidemic directly into the global story of plague. From the soil of one cemetery, we glimpse the biology of a pandemic, but beyond the science, East Smithfield teaches us about human choices. Faced with overwhelming death, Londoners did not abandon burial rituals altogether. They organized, they consecrated ground, they brought priests, they arranged. the dead in order. Even when death piled up in numbers beyond comprehension, the impulse toward dignity persisted. This matters. It tells us that, in catastrophe, people still cling to meaning, and yet the absence of monuments also speaks. Unlike great battles or royal burials, East Smithfield had no stone marker. The dead were anonymous. In this sense, it was both a dignified burial and a forgetting. Thousands vanished, their identities unrecoverable, their names lost. Today, we know them only as skeletons numbered in excavation records, data points in scientific studies. Their individuality dissolved into the scale of the epidemic. The reflection is sobering. How many of the people around you, today's friends, family, neighbors, would be remembered by name centuries later if catastrophe struck? Or would they, like those at East Smithfield, become anonymous in mass memory, remembered only as part of a statistic? In the end, East Smithfield is not only a cemetery, it is a mirror. It shows us how societies respond to overwhelming loss, with organization, with ritual, with silence, and with forgetting. It shows us how fragile identity can be, and how easily the ordinary are folded into anonymity. It also shows us resilience, capacity to keep going, to dig trenches, to continue living in the midst of collapse today. When visitors walk near the Tower of London, they pass close to the ground where East Smithfield lies. Most do not know. The site is not part of tourist itineraries, not framed with drama. The dead remain quiet, their lessons whispered only to those who study. But the silence is powerful. It reminds us that history is not always in monuments and palaces. Sometimes it is in the soil, in trenches filled with those who once walked the same streets we now walk. And so we leave East Smithfield with a question. In future centuries, when archaeologists study the remains of our own time, what will they see? Will they find traces of our pandemics, our losses, our resilience? Will they judge us by how we buried our dead, or by how we remembered or forgot them? Asterisk in Italy, the Black Death arrived by sea. Ships pulled into ports Messina, Genoa, Venice bearing goods from the eastern Mediterranean. But hidden among cargoes of cloth, grain, and spices were rats, and hidden within rats were fleas. And within fleas, the bacterium that would unravel Europe when the plague reached the crowded port towns of Italy in 1347. It spread inland with shocking speed, following trade roads, rivers, and pilgrims' paths. Italy was a land of city, states, and villages, abbeys, and markets, each closely tied to networks of trade and faith. And at the center of faith stood the clergy. Priests, monks, and friars were responsible not only for guiding the souls of the living, but also for preparing the dying and burying the dead. When the plague descended, many fled, as did merchants, nobles, and even physicians. But some clergy remained. They stayed in villages, in monasteries, in towns overcome by pestilence, choosing to confront the tide of death. Their presence left its mark in chronicles. Italian notaries recorded how priests continued to administer the last rites. The extreme unction, even as victims collapsed in numbers too great to count. Count described brothers carrying out the bodies of fellow monks, ringing bells over and over as their communities diminished. These accounts are not written with drama, but with weariness, as if the chroniclers could scarcely comprehend what they were witnessing. Imagine Florence in 1348, the year Boccaccio would later immortalize in the Decameron. Tales of its churches toll ceaselessly. Priests moved from house to house, often without pause, bringing sacraments to the sick. They breathed in the same air, touched the same bodies, can return to their cloisters, knowing they, too, may not live through the week. Some fled, but others remained, bound by vows, by duty, or by sheer inertia in the face of disaster. The role of priests in this moment was not only spiritual, but practical. Okay, they oversaw burials, consecrated pits, and maintained some form of ritual in the chaos. Okay. In many Italian towns, mass graves resembled those of East Smithfield in London, but unlike London's royal sanctioned field, Italian burials often fell under the care of monasteries or local clergy. Even when trenches filled quickly, priests strove to perform the rites, even if hurried, even if whispered over dozens at once. But staying came at a price. Clergy died in staggering numbers. Monastic records show entire communities reduced to half or less. Parish priests in small towns vanished, their absence noted only in later records when replacements had to be appointed. The very men who sought to mediate between the living and the dead became part of the death themselves. Their burials, however, often differed from others. Priests were sometimes interred in distinct parts of cemeteries or within monastic cloisters. Excavations in Italian churchyards revealed clusters of clerical graves, sometimes hurried, sometimes marked with the simplest of crosses. They were buried with their communities, but set apart, so that their role in life carried into death. What makes their story haunting is not only their courage, but their ordinariness. Many did not stay out of heroism, but because they had no means to flee. A village priest could not abandon his parish without consequence. A monk, bound by vows, could not simply walk away. Their persistence was, in some sense, compelled. Yet it preserved some thread of ritual in the unraveling of life. Archaeological evidence supports this. In certain Italian sites, such as the monastery, cemeteries near Pisa, rows of clerical graves from the plague years reveal systematic burials, each body positioned with care, even amid epidemic collapse. Unlike lay people hastily thrown into pits, priests were often still given individual places, as if the community clung to the importance of their presence, even when overwhelmed. But what did the priests themselves think? Chroniclers suggest a mix of resignation and confusion. Some believed the plague was God's punishment, a scourge for sins unrepented. Others viewed it as a mystery, something no theology could explain. In either case, their task remained to bless the dying, to bury the dead, to keep faith alive, even when faith seemed strained to breaking. Their decision to remain shaped memory. In later centuries, survivors recalled the priests who did not leave. Their burials became markers of continuity, signs that some had endured the plague, not by fleeing, but by staying in the thick of it. And yet, this raises a question. Did their presence truly help the living, or did it only tie more people into the cycle of infection? Were the priests, in their duty, also carriers, spreading the plague from house to house, church to church? Asterisk, the role of clergy during the Black Death in Italy was a paradox. On one hand, they were essential. The dying longed for rites, for confession, for absolution. In a world where salvation was mediated through sacraments, the priest was indispensable at the bedside. On the other hand, their very presence could mean the further spread of infection. Priests went from house to house, touching, breathing, praying. They gave comfort, but perhaps also carried death. Records from Italian towns emphasize this tension. In Siena, a city ravaged by the plague in 1348, chroniclers wrote that priests could not keep up with the demand. Some collapsed mid-service, dying while administering sacraments. Others survived long enough to move from one house to the next, blessing multiple families in a single day, only to fall ill themselves. The speed of the disease outpaced their capacity. Even the act of giving communion, of pressing bread to lips, became a possible channel for contagion. This duality, priests as comforters and as carriers, was not lost on contemporaries. Some accused the clergy of recklessness, claiming that their movements spread the disease. Others, however, viewed their persistence as an act of devotion, proof that they were willing to sacrifice their lives for their communities. Both perspectives were true. Duty and danger were inseparable. The mortality among clergy was staggering. Parish records from northern Italy reveal gaps names of priests replaced suddenly by new appointments. Monastic chronicles often record entire brotherhoods, reduced by half or more in a matter of months. In one Benedictine monastery near Milan, the necrology shows the deaths of nearly every senior monk within the span of a single year. The survivors were novices, barely trained, suddenly thrust into leadership because experience had been buried in the plague pits. The burials of clergy reflect this collapse. In some cases, priests were interred with ritual distinctions, shrouded in vestments, buried near altars or within monastery walls. In others, the sheer tide of death forced their inclusion in mass trenches. Archaeological evidence from Pisa and Lucca reveals rows of clerical graves, some marked by simple wooden crosses, now long rotted away. These sites show attempts at continuity, the effort to preserve ritual, even when overwhelmed. Yet, alongside these faithful servants were those who fled. Not every priest remained. In Florence, some higher-ranking clergy abandoned their posts, retreating to countryside villas. Boccaccio, in the Decameron, notes bitterly that both the wealthy and the clergy sought safety in flight, leaving behind the poor. This created tension in communities, resentment toward those who left, reverence for those who stayed. For those who remained, daily life was a litany of exhaustion. Imagine a parish priest in a small Tuscan town. Morning brought the toll of bells, signaling yet another death. He hurried from house to house, performing last rites, hearing confessions whispered through fever. At midday, he joined gravediggers at the churchyard, blessing pits as bodies were lowered. In the evening, he returned to a monastery or rectory, half empty, his brothers already dead. And the cycle repeated until one day he too felt fever and swelling, and others parried him with the same hurried prayers. The written accounts from this period echoed this monotony of despair. One chronicler in Pistoia noted simply, "The priests no longer distinguish one name from another. They say the words for all at once." In other words, the sacraments themselves became blurred, compressed, adjusted to the impossible numbers. Faith was stretched, not abandoned, but reshaped under strain. Yet in this very compression lies a lesson. Even when overwhelmed, communities sought to preserve ritual. The words may have been hurried, the gestures abbreviated, but the idea of care persisted. It was not simply about theology, it was about continuity. In the face of a disaster that stripped away so much, the persistence of ritual anchored people to something familiar. But this raises an unresolved tension. Did the priests who remained prolong meaning, or did they hasten death? Did their faith save souls, or did their movement between houses carry the very plague that destroyed so many bodies? As the Black Death receded from Italy in the early 1350s, what remained was not only the loss of half the population, but also the memory of those who had stayed behind. Among them, the priests, friars, and monks who had chosen or been compelled to remain with their flocks became symbols in the years that followed. Their graves dotted monasteries and churchyards, some distinct, others lost in common trenches. Her memory, however, lingered in chronicles and in the quieter resilience of communities that survived. The effect of clerical deaths was profound. Entire parishes were left without priests. Monasteries that had once housed dozens were reduced to a handful. Some orders, such as the Franciscans and Dominicans, saw severe declines, their missions disrupted. This created a ripple effect. Communities bereft of spiritual guidance, sacraments left unadministered, children growing up without baptism, marriages unblessed, funerals unmarked. Faith was not abandoned, but its structures had been shattered. The survivors were often unprepared novices, young men barely trained suddenly became abbots, confessors, preachers. The loss of elders created a vacuum of authority, and in that vacuum, new voices emerged. Some reached repentance with renewed severity, seeing the plague as divine wrath. Others turned to mysticism, searching for meaning in visions and private revelations. The absence of experienced priests left space for experiments in faith, some of which would shape Italian spirituality for generations. Yet, in remembering the priests who remained, communities also shaped a narrative of sacrifice. Chroniclers often praised those who stayed, contrasting them with those who fled. Parishioners remembered with gratitude the priests who carried bodies to burial or whispered prayers at deathbeds. In this way, the memory of their endurance became a moral anchor. In times when faith seemed fragile, the image of the steadfast priest was a reminder that some had faced catastrophe without abandoning duty. Archaeology reinforces this story. Excavations at certain Italian sites reveal clusters of clerical graves from the plague years, suggesting that priests were buried together, perhaps as a final mark of solidarity. In Pisa, for instance, the cemetery of a Dominican convent shows rows of burials from the mid-14th century, concentrated in a short span of time. The bones tell the same tale as the chronicles. Clergy fell in extraordinary numbers. Their community diminished almost overnight. The paradox remains, however. These priests were both protectors and, inadvertently, vectors. Their presence gave comfort, but may have spread contagion further. In their devotion, they participated in the very transmission they could not comprehend. Faith demanded their presence. Biology punished it. Yet without them, the collapse of ritual and community might have been even more devastating. This is the haunting lesson of their graves. Human intention and human consequence do not always align. The priests meant to save souls, and in some ways they did. But they also became part of the chain of plague, their own deaths feeding the statistics of devastation. And yet, centuries later, what lingers is not accusation, but remembrance. The chronicles honor their service. Archaeology shows their persistence. Their presence is remembered less for spreading disease than for preserving meaning when meaning itself was under threat. When you think of the priests who would not leave, picture not grand cathedrals or heroic sermons, but ordinary figures. A friar leaning over a bed to whisper absolution. A monk carrying the body of a brother into a cloistered grave. A parish priest trudging between cottages with weary steps. Their heroism, if it can be called that, was quiet, reluctant, compelled by circumstance. Yet it left a trace strong enough that centuries later still recall it. Their story concludes with a question: when the world collapses, is it better to flee and survive, or to remain and serve, even at the cost of one's life? The priests of Italy chose to remain. Their bones lie in cloisters and trenches, silent witnesses to faith in the shadow of pestilence. Asterisk if London and Florence remind us of plague in the great centers of medieval Europe. Lubeck shows us the other face of the story, the merchant city, tied to trade routes that both enriched and doomed it. Lubeck, in the 14th century, was one of the jewels of the Hanseatic League, the commercial confederation that dominated trade across the Baltic and North Seas. Its warehouses, filled with grain, fish, furs, and timber, its harbors thronged with ships bound for Bruges, Novgorod, Bergen, and beyond. Wealth streamed in through its gates. But with that wealth came the inevitability of contagion. When the Black Death moved northward in the late 1340s, stood in its path, the city was not a passive victim, it was a hub of connection. Its markets and docks drawing travelers from every direction. Merchants arrived from the south with cloth and wine, from the east with wax and furs, from the north with stockfish, from the west with cloth. Each route carried opportunity. Its route also carried fleas, rats, and the unseen bacterium. Archaeological discoveries around Lübeck tell the story. In the late 20th century, excavations revealed a ring of mass burials encircling parts of the medieval city. These were not the ordinary parish graveyards of daily life, but hastily dug trenches to absorb the sudden influx of the dead. The bones, laid in rows, testified to the shock that overcame the city. It's like London's East Smithfield, Lübeck created spaces outside ordinary cemeteries, turning open ground into receptacles of mortality. The city records echo the bones. Documents from Lübeck's council show a sudden decline in revenue, a collapse of normal trade, and urgent measures to manage the crisis. Gravediggers were employed in numbers far beyond the ordinary. The church struggled to keep up with funerals. The merchants who had once counted profits now counted losses, both of goods and of people. What is striking about Lübeck's story is how the plague intersected with the city's identity. This was not merely a place of markets, it was a place defined by its connections. The very trade routes that made Lübeck prosperous also made it vulnerable. Ships that once brought wealth now brought death. Caravans that sustained commerce now carried contagion. The city was caught in a web it had itself helped weave. The bones tell us even more. Archaeologists studying the ring of burials around Lübeck noted the presence of both men and women, children and infants, laid side by side. The plague did not discriminate, but the skeletal evidence also revealed lives shaped by labor and trade. Many of the men showed signs of maritime work, muscle attachments indicating heavy lifting, spinal wear from hauling cargo, joint stress from constant movement. The women's bones bore the marks of malnutrition and repeated childbirth, common among merchant households where wives kept homes while husbands voyaged out here again. The plague exploited pre-existing conditions. The poor, crowded into the city's less desirable quarters, died in larger numbers. Their graves filled first, and their bodies were interred in the great trenches. Wealthier merchants might have fled temporarily to estates in the countryside, but many returned or were caught regardless. Lübeck's prosperity could not shield it. The city's chroniclers wrote of despair, but also of commerce continuing despite the losses. Even as graves multiplied, ships still docked. Trade never fully ceased because the Hanseatic network could not afford to stop. This meant that contagion continued as well. Lübeck was both a victim of the plague and a vehicle for its spread, sending infected ships onto Bergen, Stockholm, and Novgorod. The same docks that built its fortune became the plague's gateway north. The ring of bones is not only evidence of death, it is evidence of how interconnected medieval Europe had become. Unlike isolated villages, Lübeck's fate was tied to distant ports. Its suffering echoed outward, carried by the winds of trade. And yet, beneath this global story, here are still the individual burials, rows of skeletons, carefully aligned, even in haste. Children placed beside adults, families buried together, strangers united by epidemic. The archaeological layers show the stages of the plague. Initial burials, orderly. Later, ones hurried, overlapping, desperate. The soil preserves the rhythm of catastrophe. Standing in Lübeck today, among its preserved medieval streets and brick Gothic churches, it is difficult to imagine the city overwhelmed by pestilence. Tourists walk where merchants once traded, unaware that beneath the cobbles lie the silent witnesses of plague. The bones are still there, encircling the city, mute reminders of how prosperity and vulnerability are never far apart. But one question lingers. Did Lübeck's merchants understand in that moment that their very lifeline to sea? The trade routes, the constant exchange, was also their undoing. Or did they, like so many, continue their routines, unable to see the invisible? currents of contagion woven into the fabric of their wealth. The tragedy of Lübeck's plague years can be traced not only in its mass graves, but in the lives of the people who filled them. Lübeck was a merchant city, its rhythms tied to commerce, its fortunes dependent on ships and caravans. The skeletons discovered in the ring of plague burials reflect this identity. They were not only peasants or townsfolk, they were traders, dock workers, sailors, and their families, ordinary people who carried on the business of a thriving Baltic hub until the disease caught them. Skeletal analysis revealed the imprint of work on their bodies. Many male skeletons show enlarged muscle attachments on arms and shoulders, evidence of hauling ropes, cargo, and sails. Spinal compression and worn vertebrae suggest long hours lifting heavy goods on and off ships. These were the bodies of dock workers and sailors, the physical backbone of Lübeck's trade. The plague did not strike abstractly, it struck those whose labor moved the lifeblood of the Hanseatic League, women's skeletons. 2. Reflect the burdens of life in a merchant city. Enamel hypoplasia on teeth points to episodes of malnutrition in childhood, even within a city of wealth. This suggests inequality. While merchants prospered, not all households shared equally. Many women bore the physical scars of repeated pregnancies. Pelvic bones widened from childbirth, and in some cases, damage suggested complications that shortened lives even before plague arrived. These women, often left behind while husbands sailed, carried both domestic and economic burdens, maintaining households while trading voyages stretched across months or years. Children were not spared. Excavations uncovered small graves among the pits, tiny skeletons laid beside adults. Some bore the skeletal marks of rickets or chronic illness, reminders that urban life in medieval Lübeck was harsh long before plague. The disease swept through all ages, but children's presence in the trenches is a reminder of the universality of loss. Families were buried together, with names erased, but their closeness preserved in death. The records of Lübeck's council during these years reveal the desperate measures taken. Officials mandated the cleaning of streets, the regulation of burials, the appointment of gravediggers. Ships were sometimes quarantined, though in practice, trade was too vital to halt completely. Even when death filled the city, merchants weighed profit against risk. Fleas and rats paid no attention to ordinances, and so the plague persisted, riding ships outward into the wider Hanseatic world. The irony was bitter. It's the very network that made Lübeck wealthy, the trade routes north to Scandinavia, east to Novgorod, west to Bruges also became the channels of plague. Lübeck's ships carried not only goods, but contagion, seeding outbreaks across the Baltic. Bergen, Stockholm, Riga, and Novgorod all saw plague in the wake of Hanseatic traffic. The city's strength became its weakness, its lifeline, a pipeline of death, and yet commerce continued. This is one of the more sobering lessons of Lübeck's plague story. Even at the height of epidemic, trade did not cease. Ships still set sail. Markets still opened. The living continued to buy, sell, and barter, even as burials multiplied. The rhythm of commerce was slowed, distorted, but not broken. In this, Lübeck exemplifies a truth of pandemics. Societies rarely stop altogether. Even in fear, survival requires continuity. The burials themselves reflect this tension. Archaeologists noted that while the graves were mass trenches, they retained order. Bodies were laid with some care, in rows, not thrown haphazardly. Thin layers of soil sometimes separated groups. This suggests that even amid crisis, Lübeck's community, perhaps its clergy, perhaps its council, sought to preserve dignity. Ritual and structure persisted, just as trade persisted. Life did not collapse entirely, even when surrounded by death. But within this persistence lies a question. What did survival mean for those left behind? Merchants who lived on carried memory of lost partners and family. Sailors who endured, remembered. Shipmates buried in trenches. Wives who remained, carried households hollowed by loss. Lubeck endured as a city, but within its walls, every survival was shadowed by absence. The ring of bones around the city is not merely a cemetery. It is a perimeter of memory. It encircled Lubeck then as death, and now as history. Each trench is a reminder that wealth and connection cannot shield a city from catastrophe. Sometimes they ain't invited. And so, we are left with another question. Did Lubeck's leaders and merchants see plague as an interruption, something temporary, or did they realize, even then, that it would permanently alter their city and the world it traded with? Asterisk. When the plague tide ebbed from Lubeck, the city was not the same. Death had swept its streets, filled its trenches, and left a silence that even the bustle of merchants could not immediately erase. Yet Lubeck did not collapse. Its docks reopened, its markets revived, and ships once again sailed into the Baltic. The Hanseatic League continued to dominate northern trade for another century. But beneath that recovery, the memory of plague lingered in bones, in records, and in the subtle reshaping of society. The ring of plague burials around the city is itself a testimony to both devastation and adaptation. The trenches were dug, not randomly, but in deliberate arcs, forming a rough perimeter around Lubeck's edges. Archaeologists have debated why. Is it simply convenience? Open land available for digging? Or was there a deeper instinct at work placing the dead beyond the ordinary spaces of life, encircling the city with a cordon of silence? Whatever the reason, the arrangement gives the impression that Lubeck was wrapped, literally and symbolically, by its plague losses. The aftermath was visible in demography. Lubeck, like many European cities, lost perhaps 1/3 to 1/2 of its population. Skilled laborers vanished. Guilds shrank. Apprenticeships faltered. The merchant elite, though struck, often survived better than the poor, thanks to resources and temporary refuge outside the walls. Yet, even among the wealthy, families disappeared, partnerships collapsed, inheritances shifted. Tarics reordered households as much as it thinned them. Economically, the plague paradoxically created openings. With fewer workers, wages rose. Survivors found new bargaining power, forcing guilds and councils to adjust. Widows inherited trading rights, stepping into roles once reserved for husbands. The merchant houses of Lubeck adapted, but they did so in a changed social fabric, one where absence was everywhere visible. Spiritually, the plague left its mark in churches and chronicles. Lubeck's churches recorded special masses for the dead, prayers for deliverance, and the establishment of chantries funded by merchant families seeking to ensure salvation for lost kin. Chronicles written in the decades afterward remembered the plague with brevity, but with gravity. In that year, one Lubeck record states, many thousands died, and the city was diminished. No elaborate description, no drama, just the flat recording of catastrophe, as if words could not capture the scale. The bones themselves preserve what chronicles do not. They reveal not only plague, but pre-existing hardship, malnutrition, toil, disease. They remind us that the victims were not nameless abstractions, but workers, sailors, mothers, children. In their rows, we see families buried together, strangers sharing a final resting place, the city's population literally layered into the soil. Each trench is both a loss and a record. Centuries later, when archaeologists unearthed these graves, Lubeck had long since forgotten their exact locations. Streets had been paved, buildings raised, life moved forward. The dead lay in silence until science returned to hear their story. What emerged was not only confirmation of plague, but insight into the rhythms of medieval urban life, the toll of labor, and the inequalities of survival. The Ring of Bones became not only a symbol of death, but a rare archive of how ordinary people lived before they succumbed. And yet, the question persists. How did those who survived carry the memory? Did merchants who returned to their ships glance at the empty places once filled by shipmates? Did widows, managing households, silently measure every day against those lost years? Did children who lived through the plague grow up haunted by the silence of vanished parents? We cannot know their private thoughts, but we can sense their resilience. Lubeck rebuilt. Its ships sailed on. Its merchants returned to markets. Trade flowed again. But beneath that continuity lay change. The city carried scars invisible to architecture, but etched into families, into guild rolls, into the bones beneath its soil. This is the enduring legacy of Lubeck's plague years. Prosperity intertwined with fragility. Connection shadowed by contagion. The Ring of Bones reminds us that wealth and networks cannot shield against disaster. Indeed, they can magnify it. And so, we leave Lubeck with an open thought. When prosperity depends on constant connection, is it also always inviting its own undoing? The city of Marseille, on France's Mediterranean coast, was a place long defined by exchange. Ships came and went constantly, carrying grain, salt, cloth, oil, and wine. It was a city of sailors, merchants, and dockside laborers exposed to every wind of commerce blowing across the sea. When the Black Death first entered Europe in 1347, it likely did so through ports much like this. And centuries later, it was in Marseille that one of the smallest and most haunting plague graves was uncovered. The grave was not a mass pit, not a trench filled with dozens of bodies. It was a single burial, carefully arranged. The body of a child archaeologist working in the city discovered the remains during excavations of an old cemetery that had lain forgotten beneath modern streets. At first, it appeared no different from countless other medieval graves. A small skeleton, fragile bones, laid eastward in Christian fashion. Yet, when teeth were sampled for analysis, something remarkable was found. Inside the enamel, preserved for centuries, lay the DNA of Yersinia pestis, Atia. The child had died of plague. More importantly, the genetic sequence provided a key link in the chain of plague's evolution. From this single burial, scientists could trace the spread and mutation of the bacterium as it moved across Europe. A forgotten child, buried in Marseille, helped explain one of history's greatest pandemics. It is striking to consider. In life, this child was one of thousands, unnoticed beyond family and neighbors. In death, they were forgotten. The grave, unmarked, the memory erased by time. But in the 21st century, their remains became globally significant, carrying data that reshaped our understanding of the plague. The anonymous became a witness dot. To imagine this child's life is to imagine the narrow streets of medieval Marseille, stone houses clustered near the port, markets filled with shouting vendors, smells of fish and salt, carts of grain pulled through cobbled lanes. Children ran among them, playing, helping with chores, watching the constant arrival of ships. Disease in such a setting was inevitable. Rats thrived in grain stores, fleas in straw bedding. Once plague arrived, it spread quickly through families. Living in close quarters, the burial shows care. The body was laid straight, arms by the sides, small bones aligned. There was no haste here, no sign of panic or trench burial. Perhaps the death occurred in the early days of plague in Marseille, before numbers overwhelmed. Perhaps the family had the means to secure a proper grave. Whatever the reason, this child was not cast into anonymity in a pit, but given an individual resting place. And yet, anonymity came later. Centuries erased the memory. The grave was forgotten, the cemetery built over, the name lost. Only the bones remained until archaeologists reopened the soil. With modern science, the child's role changed from forgotten individual to crucial witness in the story of a pandemic. This is the paradox of plague history. The vast events are recorded, the numbers, the chronicles, the sermons, but the most revealing evidence often comes from the smallest and most ordinary lives. A dock worker's spine bent from labor, a mother's pelvis scarred from childbirth, a child's tooth holding the DNA of a bacterium. These fragments, more than grand chronicles, bring us closest to the truth. The child of Marseille was no different from countless others who perished. But through chance preservation, their remains have illuminated the hidden path of plague. Science can now show how the bacterium moved, mutated, and endured, linking medieval pandemics to later outbreaks. One life, lost and forgotten, now explains centuries. But as we stand at the edge of this small grave, another question emerges. Does science in uncovering DNA truly restore memory, or does it only turn a life into data? Does the child of Marseille return as an individual or remain an anonymous witness for history? Asterisk. The most fragile part of the human body can sometimes be the most enduring. Teeth, harder than bone, often outlast centuries of burial. And inside their enamel lies a hidden vault pulp indented, sealed away from the outside world. For archaeologists and geneticists, this vault is priceless. It can preserve the microscopic traces of diseases that ended lives long ago. The child of Marseille is remembered today, not through a name, chronicle, or a monument, but through teeth. When archaeologists sampled the small molars, they discovered genetic fragments of Yersinia pestis. That bacterium, which had killed millions across Europe, was preserved in silence, locked inside enamel since the 14th century. The DNA retrieved from this child was not merely confirmation that plague had struck. Marseille chroniclers had already told us that. Instead, it was evidence of how the plague bacterium itself changed over time. By comparing the genome in this child's tooth with samples from London, Lubeck, and other sites, scientists traced the evolution of the disease. The Black Death was not a single event, but a process, a bacterium shifting as it traveled, seeding new outbreaks for centuries. In this way, the forgotten child became part of a vast scientific puzzle. Their tooth served as a point of comparison, a marker in the timeline of plague's journey. What medieval chroniclers described in fear and metaphor guides wrath. Pestilence, corruption of the air modern science can describe in genomes and mutations. And yet, both perspectives circled the same reality. A child who lived, sickened, and died in Marseille during one of the darkest times in European history. The broader cemetery where the child was found also tells us about life. In Marseille, many burials show signs of poverty, skeletons with thin bones, enamel defects from childhood malnutrition, evidence of disease long before plague. Marseille was a bustling port, but like all medieval cities, its wealth was uneven. Merchants profited from ships and warehouses, while laborers struggled with meager wages and crowded living conditions. The child likely belonged to this poorer majority, living in close quarters where plague spread fastest. Our archaeological context matters here. Unlike mass graves seen in London or Lubeck, this child was buried individually, suggesting that the burial occurred early in the epidemic or in a family plot. It is possible the family, despite poverty, sought to preserve dignity in death. A priest may have whispered prayers, neighbors may have gathered. The grave itself was modest, but it was careful. Modern laboratories, with their sterile equipment and computer models, can seem far removed from such a scene. And yet, they are linked. The DNA retrieved in 21st century Marseille connects directly to a child's fever in the 14th century. The family's grief, a small body lowered into the soil. The gap of centuries collapses in a fragment of genetic code. The discovery also reshaped historical debates. For decades, scholars argued over whether the Black Death was truly caused by Yersinia pestis. Some suggested anthrax or viral hemorrhagic fevers instead. The teeth of the child, along with other plague victims, settled the question. The bacterium was real, it was present, and it matched modern strains. The science confirmed the chronicles, and in doing so, gave the child of Marseille an unexpected voice in history. But there is a haunting aspect to this. The child's body has been reduced to data points in scientific papers, genome sequences in databases, charts on evolutionary pathways. Their individuality remains unknown. Their name, their family, their voice, their play in the narrow streets. Science restores part of their story, but only part. They become both remembered and forgotten simultaneously, and this leads to a lingering question. In uncovering their DNA, have we honored their life or simply used it? Is remembrance measured by names and stories, or by the knowledge we gain from their remains? The child of Marseille, like the countless others who perished during the Black Death, left no written record. No chronicle mentions them. No parish roll preserves their name. Okay? No monument marks their grave. Okay? And yet, across centuries, they have become a witness to history precisely because their bones remained, and because science could speak where memory failed. This is the paradox of plague history. The most ordinary, the most forgotten, sometimes become the most illuminating. A child's tooth sealed against time, carried within it the key to confirming the bacterium of the Black Death, tracing its mutations and connecting medieval mortality to modern understanding. In life, the child was anonymous. In death, it became a cornerstone of knowledge. The cemetery in which the child lay was eventually paved over. Forgotten as Marseille expanded, daily life, with its markets and ships, simply moved on. Generations passed above the ground, never knowing who lay beneath. It was only when archaeologists dug carefully through layers of soil that the child returned to notice. And even then, their presence was not marked with ceremony, but with sampling, teeth extracted, DNA sequenced, data published. Their name remains unknown, but their significance endures. Marseille itself endured as well. The plague tore through the city, as it did so many others, cutting its population nearly in half. Trade faltered, households collapsed, fear overwhelmed. But in time, ships sailed again, merchants returned, families rebuilt. The city continued, scarred but not destroyed. And in that continuation lies another paradox. The child was forgotten, not because their life was unimportant, but because life itself went on. Forgetting is often the price of survival. What does it mean then to remember a plague victim? Is it in the prayers whispered at their burial, prayers no one now can hear? Is it in the chronicles that listed numbers without names? Is it in the DNA sequence preserved in databases? Detached from the child's identity, but tied to the broader story of humanity's struggle with disease. Each form of remembrance is partial, incomplete. Together, they form a shadow of memory, a way of keeping the forgotten half seen. The child of Marseille reminds us that history is not only palaces and kings, not only chronicles and battles. It is also small bodies laid in the earth, unmarked graves beneath city streets, ordinary lives erased by catastrophe. And sometimes, those ordinary lives speak louder than the monuments of the mighty Dot. As we close this story in the series that began with the grave at Le Chivo, moved through the pits of London and Lubeck, and lingered with priests in Italy, we return to the same question. What does it mean to be the first victim, the mass victim, the forgotten victim? Each tells a different part of the same truth. Catastrophe is not measured only in numbers, but in lives, each one carrying its own world. The soil of Europe is filled with such graves. Each one could, if unearthed and studied, tell us more about resilience, vulnerability, and the threads that connect past and present. The Black Death shaped history not through abstract forces, but through bodies, millions of them buried in silence. And so, we leave the forgotten child of Marseille with the thought, perhaps remembrance does not require a name. Perhaps it is enough that their small grave by the sea has spoken across centuries, reminding us that even the most ordinary life can carry within it the key to understanding one of the greatest tragedies in human history.